got this email at about 4 in the morning from our rector saying that he was going to be absent this morning. So we're going to do our best, and we're delighted to have Christine Mahoney. In a brief bio, I will embarrass her a little bit. She's a professor of public policy and politics at the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, and she's director of the social entrepreneurship at the University of Virginia. She's conducted field work in 7 conflict zones in Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, and Latin America for her second book, which is Failure and Hope, Fighting for the Rights of the Forcibly Displaced, which studies the advance of social entrepreneurship for the 60 million people displaced by violent conflict worldwide. To help foster innovative solutions to social problems, she launched and leads social entrepreneurship at the University of Virginia. And over the past 3 years, the initiative has introduced new courses on social entrepreneurship, scholarships to work with social enterprises, and a myriad of student activities providing hands-on experience in social innovation. She's been a Fulbright Fellow, a visiting scholar at Oxford, a National Science Foundation grant recipient, and a recipient of the Emerging Scholar Award from the American Political Science Association. So welcome, Christine.
Thank you very much.
Why don't we start by you telling us exactly what social entrepreneurship and impact investing is?
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to tell you about 2 terms that are new, but they're essentially making something new that's quite old. So a social enterprise is simply a company with some type of business model that has a social and environmental mission. So we were talking when I got here, I'm from Philadelphia originally. Some of you may have ever heard of the Barnes Foundation. It's a collection of French impressionists in Philadelphia. Mr. Barnes was a social entrepreneur. He started a company that had a social mission. He was trying to prevent childhood blindness with silver drops. And he created this really innovative cooperative model where workers, and many of whom were recently emancipated African Americans, were allowed to have a couple hours every day on the clock where they learned about art and art critique and becoming engaged citizens, and that we can be better citizens in a democracy if we think critically, and art critique is a strategy to get there. And so he called that, this kind of, you have most of your hours in work and a couple of hours for enrichment. We actually visited a social enterprise down in Appalachia called Coalfield Development that's doing a really similar model today, where they have a 33, 6, and 3 model, where people are working on the clock doing construction, but they also have hours paid on the clock where they're doing kind of education to advance their careers. So that could be learning how to be a carpenter or learning how to be a mason or stonemason or a welder. And then a couple of hours for self-care and health and mental health and working with their families. And so this idea of social enterprise is not new. Many people have been doing it for hundreds of years. But what is new is that it has taken over more share of the market. We're seeing thousands and thousands of companies that now have social and environmental missions. These aren't just trying to be less bad, but they're actually proactively trying to be good. And all of those companies require capital to grow, and that is what we refer to as impact investing. Impact investing is a newish term, right? It's become very popular in the past 15 to 20 years, but it's also not new. It has its roots in the Methodists who didn't want to invest in the slave trade. They didn't want to invest in alcohol and tobacco. And then the Quakers also became very active in this space and created investment funds that people could safely invest in and know that their monies weren't going to investing in war and investing in weapons and investing in kind of things that cause harm. We see that move forward in time to the anti-apartheid movement, right? Many of you may have been in college when there was a big push to divest from apartheid South Africa. That was incredibly successful. And that work then led to increased divestment campaigns that we looked at in the early 2000s, the movement to divest from Khartoum, now embroiled again in civil war, but at the time trying to take capital away from the companies that were investing in the genocide in Darfur. And more recently, we see it tacked onto this idea around climate change and the link between fossil fuels and climate change and people divesting from fossil fuels. Some people refer to these as sin stocks, right? You want, depending on whatever your religious background is, you want to invest in a way that aligns with your values. And you don't want to be investing in companies that are directly opposed to the things that you believe in. And so some people refer to that as socially responsible investing, right? The Catholics have their funds, the Quakers have their funds, there's Jewish funds that are all aligned with their value set. And one of the challenges, though, when you divest from sin stocks, you need to reinvest in something. And so that is this world of impact investing, proactively investing in companies that are trying to make the world a better place. And so I get to do that work all around the world. Specifically, I work with a big team of impact investors looking at how we deploy these ideas of social enterprise and impact investing for refugees. But we were talking earlier, sometimes donors and philanthropists have great ideas, and they can be kind of partners in co-creating new strategies. And so that's what led to the work that I'm now doing in Appalachia for the Batten School. We had a donor who went to UVA, and early in his career, he spent time down in Appalachia. And he was sad to see the change in the economy and how difficult many of the issues are down in Appalachia. And he asked, we have so many UVA students going around the world, doing very good work in places like sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, and that is important, but it's, in a way, it wasn't interesting enough or fiery enough to be doing work in the most impoverished aspects of the United States. And so he asked this question, could we be doing something in that space? And so we co-created this program together on impact investing in Appalachia, where we take students down to far Southwest Virginia and all through the Appalachian region, which is 13 different states all in the mountains of Appalachia, all the way up from New York down to Georgia in the south. And that involves hundreds and hundreds of counties, many of whom are trying to figure out what's next for their economies. When we hear of Appalachia, the news is not good, right? When we hear of Appalachia, many people think of some dark and dangerous movies from the 1980s, right? They might think of the opioid epidemic, they might think of the demise of coal, and that's about it. And so we have had the opportunity to show a different side of Appalachia. We're visiting with social entrepreneurs who are creating businesses that are creating jobs for people coming out of addiction, coming out of incarceration, creating jobs on abandoned mine land, where the land is so degraded, but it can be brought back with massive lavender fields, like one UVA alumni who has started a social enterprise down in West Virginia. And so this is this idea, how do we find the companies that really have a social mission? They're trying to put people back to work in not only jobs, but healthy jobs, living wage jobs, jobs that they can support their families, that can help bring back main streets, that can create new economies like clean energy economies, new approaches to using the technologies that we have to have a really thriving and kind of a high-paying economy, even in a rural community that might not have the density that might support traditional small businesses.
Christine, how do you identify appropriate candidates for these programs?
Well, that's one thing. I mean, it's a bit of a desk research and kind of word of mouth. So the first year that we taught this class, we were really lucky to partner with an organization that is called Invest Appalachia. And they did really deep kind of co-design work with the community for 2 years, understanding what the community needs were, what were community bright spots. And so Invest Appalachia has a network of companies that they did a great deal of research to find the companies that were the kind of the first investment in. And so we partnered with them. Then when you're in the field, you get to start hearing about other bright spots and other great companies that are being founded. Also, the UVA network is surprisingly strong. We found this UVA alumni who had been living in Pennsylvania, but she started a social enterprise in Appalachia, and they're on track to become one of the biggest lavender producers in America. They're employing hundreds of people coming out of incarceration and addiction, and they're creating a value-add product that they can ship, all over the country and all over the world. So it's really been kind of a word-of-mouth networking process, and also our donors incredibly engaged. So he sends me news articles, and I get to, find, he saw something in this magazine in Boston, and so then we look into that.
I guess I want to ask you how you measure success, but I guess under that rubric, the same question is, how sustainable are these businesses that are the beneficiaries of this program?
Right, and that's exactly the idea. The idea of a social enterprise is that it is financially sustainable because it has a business model. All of us have, I'm sure, given to charity, right? If we give to a really traditional charity like a soup kitchen, that is important. And for first emergency response in the world I work in refugee support, you need that type of charity for the most crisis situations. But when problems go on for decades, as in the case of refugees, and in the case of intergenerational poverty like we see in Appalachia, these types of charitable approaches that are essentially Band-Aids, they don't solve the root problem, right? And so that's where a social enterprise who can create a job that's paying $40,000 a year, year on in, year out, right? That supports a family year in, year out, is a more sustainable model than, hopefully raising enough money to hopefully help people with one crisis. So, that's not to say that there aren't challenges. We've met with social entrepreneurs that talk about, if you're really trying to help people coming out of addiction, and you've probably all seen the documentaries and how incredibly addictive opioids and fentanyl are, 90% of people will relapse. And when one person on your team relapses, they often will bring down other people on your team. That's hard, right? That's hard as a business owner who's trying to staff their hourly work. So it's not that it doesn't have challenges, but it is a more financially sustainable model than charitable models. And the other challenge in Appalachia is, we might look to cities like New York City or Silicon Valley where there's a lot of wealth, and where there's a lot of wealth, there's a lot of philanthropy. When you go to very impoverished regions, there really isn't the philanthropic dollars to go around. So I think it's like, maybe it's $200 per capita in Silicon Valley of philanthropic dollars, and it's like 20 in Appalachia. There isn't a lot of wealth there. The wealth that was made through coal, timber, the railroads, all of that was the holders of capital that really benefited the most from those industries were outside of Appalachia. They stayed outside of Appalachia, and those resources and then ultimately the capital it made was extracted from Appalachia. So there's really just not the philanthropic support that is needed. That's one of the pieces of this work as well, is like showcasing that you can, with some philanthropic capital, you can kind of get the flywheel kicking, and then you can get economies coming back, and you can support that more, financially sustainable strategy.
How do you measure your success? What are your benchmarks?
For the university's program or for these social enterprises?
The university program first.
Well, so when we first started, we've been doing this for 4 years now, and really at first it was, how do we get UVA students passionate about this area that, mostly all of the press is just negative. That I think we've succeeded in. We've had over 100 students now go to Appalachia, do immersive classes in Appalachia, work on getting tens of thousands of dollars of capital kind of flowing in that direction by doing things like due diligence, which is research on social enterprises working in the area. We've had dozens and dozens of students do their summer internships supporting organizations in Appalachia. So that can include nonprofits. There's a lot of nonprofits that are based on a philanthropic or grant-based model, but their focus is entrepreneurial ecosystem building or incubators trying to support entrepreneurs in these areas. And so in that way, we have kind of successfully sparked interest, successfully had students use their kind of brain capital in service of this region. And then some of them are going back. So they go back, first they go for the class and hopefully get inspired, like, oh, this actually isn't just negative news and depressing. It's incredibly beautiful. There's these beautiful, sweet main streets that are coming back. There's social entrepreneurs that are like 30 years old and have 5 different social enterprises, and they're doing incredible work, incredible impact, and it doesn't require as much capital, right? If you start a social enterprise in Silicon Valley, you need to raise millions of dollars. If you start a social enterprise in West Virginia or far Southwest Virginia, you don't need as much capital, right? Rent is lower, cost of business is lower, cost of wage is lower, et cetera. So you can do more with less. So I think they get inspired and then they've gone back and done summer internships. We've only been at it for 4 years, but our hope is that some subset of them maybe will spend a year after they graduate, or maybe they fall in love so much that they spend an early part of their career there. So that's one aspect. I think another aspect of impact is just getting in the press. We've been very lucky. UVA today has done a lot of showcases of the work. And so we've received dozens and dozens of emails from UVA alumni around the country that had roots in Appalachia or were from far southwest Virginia, or even just rural Virginia, and glad that we're focusing on rural issues and rural economic kind of growth. And they're proud that the university is doing this work. So I think that that's an important piece. And then I guess the third piece is the donor has just given a big gift for us to expand the program, not only continue it into the future, but expand it and include graduate students. So this summer, we're launching, we'll have 10 graduate students that will spend their entire capstone project working for Appalachian clients. So these are economic development agencies, nonprofit business incubators, community development financial institutions, and we're going to be able to support these communities with thousands of pro bono hours.
You have to run programs that are designed to educate not the students, but the population in such basic things as financial literacy. And how do you do that? You have people on the ground to do that.
Well, really, in this world, we kind of feel like we are the students. We're learning so much from these impact investors that are working in the area, philanthropists. So there's something called the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky that are doing really innovative work. The entrepreneurs running everything from smaller businesses to big publicly traded businesses like App Harvest, which is a huge hydroponic food production facility that's in Appalachian Kentucky that we got to visit. So we're learning a lot from them. The students are learning from them, I'm learning from them. But a lot of these organizations, especially CDFI, so these are community development financial institutions, they were created from a US policy that saw that there was kind of a bias toward impoverished areas and was trying to get more lending and more capital to these poor areas. They do a lot of this type of financial literacy. There's a really great organization called FAHI, which is almost like an aggregator. They take huge amounts of money that they get from the federal government, and then they help deploy it to these smaller organizations so that it can be lent out in small business loans. So again, with that example of like Silicon Valley, you need millions. If you're opening a coffee shop in Wise, Virginia, you don't need millions, right? But it's hard to find the lender who's going to lend in an area where maybe the business plan doesn't look as strong because you're not in New York City or Philadelphia. You don't have millions of people that are going to come get a cup of coffee. You have a population of 200 people, right? And so the business plan maybe doesn't look quite as strong, but the community development financial institution, which is a local lender, can say, we know this person, it's community lending, we can vouch for this person, and a coffee shop on this main street is going to help bring back this economy, and so that they can help lend. And so they do a lot of that. It's not like financial literacy training, it's more like business coaching and walking alongside the entrepreneur as they stand up a business to help make sure they succeed, because ultimately that's better for the lender and it's better for the community and the business, for the business to not fail.
You know, this is not obviously a traditional capitalist structure. So I wonder how difficult it is, because I assume investors are going to think that they have to sacrifice financial performance to achieve the goals of your program. How do you and I in a conversation talked about something called microfinance. Mm-hmm. What is microfinance, and how does that work its way into this process?
Sure, and I'll answer the first question first, which is, does it need to be concessionary, which is the term they use. And so the way that a lot of people think about it is you can do impact investing everywhere from what we might call venture philanthropy, which is business-minded, but ultimately it's philanthropy, right? When you give $100 to the United Way, you do not expect to get it back. You do not expect a return on your investment, right? You can do venture philanthropy, but for a social enterprise, like a coffee shop that's trying to get off the ground, and you can help them get their first machine, for example, like something like that. Then there's this world of what we call concessionary lending. If you invest in the stock market and you're doing well, maybe you'll make 10%, 20%, depending on how well you do, how well the year is going. You could maybe do a...
or you lose 25%.
Or you could lose 25%, exactly, right, exactly. But maybe you could do something more reliable, like a bond, right, and you get 5% back. You could also do something where you just get your principal back, right? So imagine you're a philanthropist, and you were happy to give $1,000 away. But you could lend just $1,000 and you could get that $1,000 back with no return on your investment. That's this world of kind of concessionary lending, somewhere between just your principal back and no interest to something subpar from the market. But there's also this world of you can invest for impact and get a return on your money. And so a lot of people are referring to this world as ESG investing, which is kind of it's a political hot potato right now, but what does that mean? ESG is environmental, social, and governance investing. It is simply saying, here's two companies. They both have incredible business models. They both look like really healthy financials. I look like I'm going to get a very good return. But this one measured its environmental impact and was a good environmental steward, and this one is pouring effluent into the ocean. I'm going to get a return in both cases. They're both great business investments, but this one is doing better from an environmental metric. Similarly, we could look at a tech company. We could say these two tech companies look great on their financials. They've got strong business models. Their growth and revenue are great. But this one hasn't lied to its customers, right? Or this one hasn't illegally sold their customers' data. We could look at two car companies. This one lied to the German government about its emissions. This one didn't, right? So that's that whole world of ESG investing. It's just that as an investor, you can invest for a healthy return, but some investors want to know how well that company is doing on other metrics. And the last piece I'll mention on this, the world of investing talks about, and there may be some investors out there, materiality. There's a material impact, there's a money aspect to that knowledge. Because if you invested in BP versus Exxon or something, BP did not do well on its Deepwater Horizon stewardship, right? That was bad, but it was ultimately financially bad for its stakeholders because there was millions and millions in fines, there was huge reputational hit, their stock tanked, right? So there was this material or like real world money impact because of their bad environmental performance or their bad social performance. So that's that world. You don't have to take a concessionary hit. What we're seeing is a lot of private family foundations, things like the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, right? They have these huge pots of money, their endowments or their corpus. You can't invest all of that in concessionary debt in Appalachia, right? It's a lot of money. You need to invest it somewhere. And many of these big foundations are trying to invest all of their corpus or all of their endowment in impact. That means you need to be investing in Tesla and Solar City and right, like these big companies that are going to get a healthy return so that you don't lose the corpus. And so it's a long-winded answer, but you can invest anywhere from venture philanthropy to very healthy returns and everywhere in between and have an impact throughout those different types.
Are these philanthropic dollars or are they actually loans, micro loans or mini loans made by lenders?
They run the gamut. So in the world of venture philanthropy, it would probably be philanthropy. There's something called program-related investments. So an endowment can take some of their money and instead of giving it away, they can invest it and just get the money back. We've seen private foundations here in Charlottesville do that. For example, Blue Moon Foundation did a lot of that. And then you can also, in the world of lending, you can lend, right, or you can make an equity investment. So there's an organization called Acumen Foundation, was started by a UVA alumni. It's one of the biggest impact investment funds in the world. It's deployed $300 million in impact investments to social enterprises globally. They do both debt and equity. So sometimes they'll do a $2 million loan to a social enterprise, which for the business people in the room, right, that gets paid back over time with interest and then it's done. Or they can make an equity investment, which is they own a piece of the company. So if the company does well, they can keep their stake in the company and get dividends, or they can sell their shares in the company down the line to somebody else that wants to have ownership of the company. They've done that successfully. They've grown companies like, you may have heard of D-Light on the news. It's a solar lantern. It helps communities that don't have electrical grids, that traditionally would use kerosene lamps that, give people asthma, burn children, burn down houses, that's very expensive. This is an alternative that's healthier, cleaner, more affordable, and that company's done so well that Acumen was able to, sell its shares in the company and make a really great upside. So yeah, I guess you can run the gamut from no return to full market rate return, and you can do it through debt or equity.
You mentioned, I was going to ask you about ESG, but you mentioned it. It sounds like, is this, under the rubric of ESG, is what you're doing a subset of that, or are they entirely different?
I think it's just, subset I think is an interesting way to think about it. Essentially, we had socially responsible investing, which is that kind of history I talked about where you're divesting from sin stocks. Then there was ESG investing, which is like investing in helping pick the companies that are the best, right? They're the best environmentally, they're the best to their customers, they're best and transparent in their supply chains. And then impact investing is really taking it to the limit. It's not just that they're better in environmental or they're better in their social performance, but really they're proactively trying to have a social or environmental impact.
Friendly.
Mm-hmm.
Are these funds, would they ever have any interest in participating in a program like this?
Well, it depends on the fund, right? I mean, some of these funds are at big asset managers and they're competing with other asset managers and they need to produce very high returns for their customers, or their customers will leave them and go somewhere else. In those cases, they might really just be trying to get the maximum return for like the least bad impact from a social environmental standpoint. Others are really trying to have an impact. And so that's the thing, you do see kind of an explosion of different fund options these days, everywhere from, and there's a lot of different ways to measure these things. There are some dominant ways to measure them that are coming to the fore. There's asset managers like BlackRock, which manages $7 trillion in assets. And they have gotten behind one of those. I'm not going to go through all the alphabet soup because there's like 16 alphabet soups, but there is a leading one. And many of the other asset managers are now kind of falling behind that. In the US, the SEC was looking this past year at beginning to regulate this. So as some of you may know, if you're in the business world or the investment world, all publicly traded companies have to publicly present their financial statements in the exact same way. So you can look at them and compare apples to apples. That isn't the case yet in ESG, but there is a leading platform, and the SEC was starting to take in kind of guidance from different asset managers, investors, foundations, on what they thought was the best. Because since there's so many people that want their retirements responsibly invested from an environmental, social impact standpoint, there's a lot of, the estimates are about 30 trillion in assets in this space. Then we owe it to those people for them to not be hoodwinked, or greenwashed or whitewashed. And so that's where the government's looking at, like, should we say there's like at least this is comparable so that people aren't kind of fooled with some greenwashing.
Just one last question. When you boil all of this down, what is your single biggest challenge?
I think crowding more capital in more quickly. So it's really interesting. The work I do in refugee investing worldwide and the work we're doing in Appalachia, there's a lot of the same challenges. There's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of good press. There's a lot of great entrepreneurs doing incredible work. And there just seems to be this gap on how quickly the capital's moving. Like, even after lots of trainings, right, there's something called the Global Impact Investment Network. There's something called the Intentional Endowments Network. There's the UN Principles for Responsible Investing that were started back in 2006. There's so many resources out there that I find it surprising that people are still like, this is new and I don't quite understand it yet. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to get there, but I'm not there yet. And so I find that challenging. It's like, we know we need to steer capitalism toward this, whether it's responsible capitalism or conscious capitalism, right? There's different terms for it, but I think we need to accelerate the speed of that transition.
Well, thank you. I think it'd be a good time to turn it over to questions. So if anybody has a Bob.
Well, I had a couple questions, but I guess one is, you work in the academic world, grad students and stuff. Are there any such organizations that use senior citizens who have retired and have this wealth of knowledge? Are there groups like that you know of, or anything like that?
There is. I mean, I know through the Small Business Development SBDA agency, which it essentially helps economic development in towns. they have I think it's called the CORE program. They have a program where it's often retired business people that kind of have business acumen to train and coach other people. What we see in a lot of towns that are really kind of have some energy behind them is these incubators, right? Sometimes they're often run by nonprofits, right? Because maybe you've heard of Y Combinator, right? This is a fancy incubator in Silicon Valley that is a for-profit business model because they're growing huge unicorns, right? A lot of small business incubators, like the one we have here in Charlottesville, maybe there'll be a unicorn in there, but it might just be a coffee shop, right? Which is it hires people, it's a place for meetings, it has a benefit to the community. And so in a lot of these towns, there's incubators that are either being run by nonprofits, economic development agencies, or partnered with local universities, and they always have a need for mentors. So I think if there's business experience and acumen in the room and you want to get involved, kind of reaching out to any of those incubators. Most entrepreneurs are, as if you've been an entrepreneur, you're doing everything. You have every hat. You're doing the marketing, you're doing the payroll, you're doing the job of whatever the company is. And it's really hard to even find the space to think about reaching out and finding a mentor. So I think if there's like people that are interested in mentoring, just reaching out to one of those incubators and saying, I'm here and I'm really good at X and I could, coach an entrepreneur in a small town. And now with with Zoom, it's so easy, right? You don't need to drive down to far Southwest Virginia. You could, do some Zoom mentoring over the computer.
Yes.
From a policy and politics point of view, I'm wondering what your observations are about the role that federal versus state versus local governments are playing, the level of coordination that exists between them, what are the big challenges and opportunities? Is one doing more than their fair share? Are they getting in each other's way? Just be interested in hearing more about that.
Yeah, really good question. And that's one of the things we're hoping to tackle with this new Batten Masters in Public Policy program that we're doing in Appalachia. So there is a lot of money, right? That's what we hear a lot. There's a lot of money coming from the federal government, right? There's the Inflation Reduction Act and all these new investments in renewable energy. That could be great for Appalachia, right? We're talking millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars in that bill. And it could be used, but it's really hard for understaffed local municipalities to go after that money. If anybody's ever written a grant proposal in here, it's a bear, right? And these, again, are small teams that are under-resourced, and it's really hard for them to even have the space to write one of those proposals. Another challenge is that there's something called the Appalachian Regional Commission, which has a lot of funding for this area. So that is a big grant proposal you need to write to go after. And these new programs through these different, the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think that is one of these big challenges. The grant proposals are really burdensome, not only to write, but if you get it to administer. And then often you have to have cost share, 20% cost share. So if you're a teeny tiny town with a population of 200 that has almost no tax base because there's no businesses left, how are you going to get 20% of cost share of even $1 million grant, right? It's really hard. So that is a piece. There's something that's new. We're actually crossing our fingers that we're going to get to work with them. I was just talking with their head. It's called an all-of-government initiative by the White House. It's called the Rural Partners Network. And they actually have a team of people they're putting in rural communities to help them facilitate trying to access some of this money that's already been appropriated, right? It's there for the taking, but it needs to be, you need a good plan, you need to propose for it, and you need to be able to get it. So that's one piece. And I think another piece, and this is another role I think just citizens can get involved. Some of these, especially kind of Main Street economic rebirths, require what we call capital stacks. They require some philanthropic capital. They require some tax breaks, like might be historic tax credits or new market tax credits or opportunity zone tax credits, as well as concessionary debt, as well as market rate debt, right? And that is a complicated thing to put together. And again, sometimes these communities, they're hard to find people that can do that anywhere. It's a complicated thing. It requires kind of advanced legal and financial experience. And so that's a space too. I think if there's people that are retiring from legal, for example, like some of the colleagues in the room, I think there is a real role for bringing that expertise to these complicated things, because if you can get that deal done, You can get a boutique hotel built like we saw in St. Paul down in far southwest Virginia. You can get then a beautiful restaurant in that place. Then it becomes a destination. Then you get a new state park in that place. Then you get people coming from Washington, D.C., spending a lot of money for 4 days. Then there's finally enough density that there can be a second restaurant or a brewery or a vineyard. So these are the sorts of things I think kind of helping ease that process of accessing some of that federal funding.
David, did you have a question?
I did. This is sort of a boots on the ground question and comment at the same time. Not all of Appalachia, but much of Appalachia was thriving with oil and natural gas and coal. And basically Uncle Sam took it away from them. So has your group or other groups actually gone to meet with the people local and discuss with them how they can get back to where they were from a realistic perspective? Because all that you shared today is good in a theoretical sense, but from a practical perspective, to incorporate local, state, and federal funds and investors and that sort of stuff, that's going to take forever. And a lot of these people's livelihood was completely destroyed. And that's part of the problem that you've already touched on from the opioid perspective and some people just leaving. So, I mean, I'm hearing what you're saying, but I think the reality is ultimately these people want to get back to where they can care for themselves from a business perspective. Because I think the more you have to look to any government agency for your livelihood, you'll always be disappointed. And it will never be enough. So that's kind of a comment, but I don't know if you can comment on that too.
Sure.
Just from a boots on the ground perspective, I don't see how this is really going to work.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's what the big hope for people talk about it as a just transition, but there are different aspects of that. One is like there's the push for moving away from fossil fuels. Second, there was major changes in the coal industry, right? The movement from man-operated mines underground to mountaintop removal, that was a big driver in reducing the workforce in coal, right? You went from 60,000 people making $60,000 to $80,000 a year to a mine that used to have 100 men working in it, where it had 7 with major machineries, essentially doing most of that. So that happened. Also, coal, the price of coal has gone down worldwide. Fracking was a big piece of the displacement from coal. So there is kind of human-made changes in how we want to run our energy systems. There were economic changes in how the coal industry was running its coal operations and really reducing the labor force. And then there was changes in the global price of coal. So those changes happened, and you're 100% right. Everywhere we went, and the people we talked with, community leaders and former coal miners, we're saying that it's not going to come back. We're not going to get to the situation where we have $60,000 jobs paying $60,000 to $80,000. And when politicians lie and say they're going to bring them back, it's disingenuous and it doesn't help. There is, however, the opportunity around solar and wind. Solar and wind is doing really well on the plains. It's been very good for farmers in the plains. There is an opportunity for mountain-based wind, mountain-based solar. There is hydro resources there. So I don't know how many of you are in the clean energy space in the room, but solar on our home roofs is nice. That's not going to get us to carbon zero, right? People are talking about net zero, carbon zero. To make sure the planet doesn't raise 2 degrees Celsius, we need to get to carbon zero, which means we need to drop down how much carbon we're burning, and we need to start sequestering a lot more carbon. Therefore, we need like gigaton, massive, you need utility scale solar and wind. To have utility scale solar and wind for energy to move when we need it, not only when the wind's blowing or when the sun is shining, we need storage. Batteries are not sufficient for utility scale. You need hydro storage. That's good for Appalachia. Hydro storage is when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, it pumps water up, and then when it's not shining or it's not blowing, it drops water down, turns turbines, and that's what makes clean energy. That's really good for Appalachia because there's a lot of geological difference in height altitude, and they are looking at using old mine shafts as a vehicle for this hydro storage. That's a lot of jobs. Those are high-paying jobs. So the quicker, and again, this gets to the policy piece, the quicker we can get solar installations moving in and wind energy installations moving in and hydro, is the more jobs that could be created that are actually high-paying. One of the biggest bottlenecks for that happening right now isn't capital, which is ready to flow. It isn't developers, which are ready to build. It's these grid operators. There's something called the Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland grid. Each little pieces of the country are divided up into grids. And our grid operator is 3 years behind looking at projects. I met with a multifamily landowner. She runs a social enterprise that does organic salt from a deep salt ocean, deep underneath the Appalachian Mountains that's been there for millions of years, like since the dinosaurs. And her family started mining that salt water and making salt that helped, the American frontier move west. And her family owns land, and they would like to put solar on it, and that would create good, high-paying jobs for her community. And the grid operator won't even consider their application for 2 years. And so that's where it's like, how can we have hundreds of millions of dollars appropriated for renewable projects, which will create great paying jobs, and they're being tied up by these middleman grid operators? Like, that's crazy. Like, put 100 staff people in it and start processing those applications, those development applications. So, I think you're right. It's that coffee shops are not going to save Appalachia. Main streets are not going to save Appalachia. But broadband is going in everywhere. The right kind of incubators supporting people with tech jobs that they could be doing, coding remotely. They could be doing any range of technology jobs. Another big hope is data centers. For a data center, you need, what is it called? And you need electrical redundancy, in case the power goes out. If you're storing sensitive data from the NSA in your data center deep in Appalachia, which is good from a security standpoint because the Appalachian Mountains are secure for data, but you need grid redundancy and electrical redundancy. Appalachia has that because of its coal-fired power plants from back in the day. So there's a lot of hope, and the big focus is on renewable jobs, on data center jobs, and on this opportunity around kind of remote technology work. I think it's West Virginia. They just started a new innovative policy. During COVID, a lot of people wanted to move to rural areas, right? They didn't want to be in dense urban areas anymore. So they have a program that's incentivizing kind of high-pay knowledge workers to move to West Virginia and work remotely. And that brings a high-paying job into the community, which then can support other jobs like house cleaners and people helping with childcare and re-emerging childcare systems, which is also another weakness in the area. So I think that's the big hope, is in these big new renewable infrastructure, data centers infrastructure, which could create high-paying jobs, and then remote work.
We have time for one more if there's another question. I'm sorry.
Yes, one of the questions I had is there a lookout, a sort of a review of potential investments with an eye to what kind of investments are going on nearby, either in Virginia or in Kentucky? Something that grows well in Appalachia and Southwest Virginia may also grow well in Kentucky, and then you have two parts of Appalachia potentially competing with each other, which in general should be good, but on these sort of frail startups may be bad.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's one thing we heard a lot from on the ground when we were in the communities, is that there's a lot of really good local collaboration. So there's something called the New River Gorge Development Authority, and there's 7 different counties that came together, realizing that they could work better together. They also they're right on the border. They're right on the border between Virginia and West Virginia. So they really think of themselves as an economic zone. We met with organic food hubs that are supporting organic producers to aggregate and then ship their food out to DC and Atlanta. They're working across state borders. We had the opportunity to visit the Cumberland Forest Project, which is a huge impact investment put together by the Nature Conservancy. It's using California carbon markets regenerative and restorative lumber practices, as well as job creation. And they're looking at some renewables to protect 258,000 acres of forest. And they're looking at using ecotourism as another kind of economic engine. So that is across Virginia, West Virginia, and Appalachian Tennessee, or Appalachian Kentucky. So there seems to be like an understanding, I think the way people talked about it in the communities is, if you're right on that Virginia, West Virginia border, you go to wherever the closest supermarket is, you're not really thinking about, state lines. And when we were in New River Gorge, they actually, a big team of, I think, 21 counties put together in a big grant proposal for some of the infrastructure bill dollars, and they secured it. And so that'll kind of, some of these things are, the pots of money so big, they need to collaborate because they can't actually process that much capital.
If there's another question, I think we have time for it. Pam?
I'm just wondering, can't AI and ChatGPT and all these AI different things help with some of this grant writing?
It's a good idea. We have not passed over that, we have not broached that yet, but I guess it could be good for a good first draft. It might be just as good as an undergrad's first draft. So.
Well, Christine, thank you very much for being here. We really